Hello, hello. Welcome back to Crown and Chaos. Um, we're doing something a little different today. As I said before, we're gonna have a look at ancient Sparta. Call this season two. We're getting towards the end of the 3/4 through the Plantagenet Kings, and I've been wanting to do this one for a while, and I figure I had a little bit of variety there. And as I said before, my knowledge kind of ranges from English, French, medieval Rome, and Sparta. That's kind of my Greece. That's kind of my general knowledge. As I said, my name's Rolly Mack, very amateur historian, and welcome back. So let's get into it. Now, this is my first episode where I'm really going to put a trigger warning in the beginning because I cannot talk about the Spartans without at least mentioning some pretty bad child abuse and some they had slaves and some a lot of sexuality. So I'm not going to get into any details on things like that, but it is going to be mentioned. We need to talk about that to understand Spartan society and what happened to it, how it started, how it ended. Okay, so there's my trigger warning for this episode, just in case. So who are the Spartans? Well, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the movie 300. At least if you're my age, you sure are. I think there were some spin-offs after that as well. Uh, you know, and Leonidas, sorry, I couldn't remember his name for a minute, one of the two kings at the time. Sparta had two kings. There's a lot of things about Sparta that we just don't see in any other society. There is, and there are some things that we see in Sparta that we don't see till much later, like their absolute dedication to the state. Um, this was not a society of individuals. This was not a society of pleasures. Anyway, we'll get into that. So, Sparta was founded, I do believe, um, 850 BC ish. Okay, Bronze Age, Greek Dark Age, way back. And they were they are people that came from the north of Greece, Messenia, I believe, or yeah, I can't remember exactly, but they came from the north, and they came down and they began conquering the people in this very, Messenia is the region that they conquered. They came from around the north, the same area that Alexander the Great was from. Somebody can tell me what that name is. I cannot remember. But through 25 years of war ish, they conquered these people. And these people became the Helots, the slaves. Okay. The Spartan, these were Greek people. This is another different thing about Sparta. Now, there were slaves throughout Greece. Athens had them, they all had them. The difference was the Spartans enslaved other Greek people. So they were looked at a little bit differently because of this. The rest of Greece was not comfortable with the fact that they were enslaving their own. These were actual Greek-speaking people that they enslaved, and their whole society was held up by slavery, and like it could not exist without it. So by 650 BC, Sparta is the dominant military power. So, as I mentioned, Sparta had two kings um, simultaneously. So now, how this worked, like I'm not too sure. We hear about Leonidas, we don't hear about the king that was with him, at, who ruled at the same time. So whether these men had to agree, whether they did agree, whether the constitution that they did have played a role in that, because they did have a constitution. It was created by a famous Spartan lawyer. It's I think it's debated when or who did it, but they did actually have a constitution, and they had some major political bodies besides the king. They had the council, which was a large amount of elders, a couple dozen elders, I believe. They were all over, believe they were all over 60 years old, the elders. And then they had, eventually, they would have 5 annually elected magistrates also, who had enormous power. And then all Spartans, all male Spartans, official citizens, had a name. I cannot pronounce it. Homooi, homooi. It means equal, I think, or something like that. But that is what a full Spartan citizen, male citizen, was called. So let's kind of start from the beginning. So as soon as a Spartan child was born, they were at very great risk. They were given to this council, and it was inspected. The child was inspected. Now, I don't know if they only did this with boys or if they did it with boys and girls. I do believe they did it with both, any Spartan citizen, because you know, well, the female women Spartans had a lot more rights than any other Greek at the time, and that's mostly because the men were so much hands off, and we'll get into, they didn't get involved themselves with day-to-day life. They had other things to do. Anyway, the child was at great danger because if it had any sort of deformity at all, a web toe, a birthmark, it was gotten rid of immediately. There's a legend that there's a cliff where you can still find the bones at the bottom of these children that were tossed, and the brutal society starts right from the beginning. So now the child lives with his mother, and I say his mother because the father spent most times at these clubs that they had, all male clubs, where all they did was train. So the child was brought up with the daughters that are not married yet, the mother, and of course the helots, the slaves. Okay. Another thing to note too is individuals did not own the slaves. The slaves were all owned by the states and basically lent out. Once a male Spartan was given full citizenship, he was given a wife, he was given lands, and he was given helots to use. He didn't own any of it. The state owned all of it, but it was his to run. Okay. It was his to bring income from, food, take care of his family, that kind of thing, and to make more Spartans, which was the number one priority for any Spartan, was to make more, because the Spartans only, only had anywhere between 20 and 30,000 fighting men at their peak. Okay. Now, the reasons for this are obvious. They tossed children off cliffs. The training was brutal. They would fight the wars. you know, we talk about the the battle that Leonidas went in. Sorry, I don't remember the name of it, but the 300 Spartans that held the pass against these 100,000 Persians or whatever. Well, they don't. They always forget to mention the 7,500 Athens Greeks that were there with them as well. But it wasn't just you know oracles saying you can't go to war, and they probably did have something to do with that. But the fact is, every time the Spartans went off to war, they had a giant slave revolt. They couldn't fight a foreign war for very long, and they certainly couldn't send a lot of men because every time they did, the helots rose up. There was like 7 or 8 helots to every one Spartan. They were far outnumbered, the Spartans, and the only thing that kept them in line was the fighting force there at home. So there's a problem the society had right off the bat. Sparta famously had no walls. The walls were its men and shields. They didn't need walls, right? They couldn't go off and fight with maybe very giant forces, but they certainly could stay home and defend. But anyway, so a boy, when he turned 7 or 8, was taken to a boys' school. Okay, and this is where the regime of training, of military training, began. Literally around 7, 8 years old. So there's boys from 7 to 12 years old generally at the school, and it is a brutal test of endurance. Children died at these schools. Some of the tests I heard they would do, they would take a boy, they'd put food at the end of this long table with the other boys lined up on either side of him, and he'd have to run to get the food while being beaten on with sticks, kicked and punched. And yeah, that was one of the ways they did training. So that's how Spartan boys started. When they got older, in their teens, there was a special force of them that were almost, I guess you could almost call them a secret police of some sort, the secret service of the Spartans, but they roamed the streets at night looking for escaped slaves. And it was designed to put fear into the slaves. These guys were vicious, preteen boys, teen boys, and another thing that's interesting about Spartan is if you're expected, if you wanted to eat, you could steal food. God forbid you get caught. You were got in trouble more for being caught than the stealing of the food. You know, you got to eat. That's the way the system went. So at about 12 years old, if you live through this school, you are given to a full citizen, which is a man above the age of 30. That was the number, which pretty much middle aged in those days. And a 12-year-old boy, and you are given to this male to continue training and to do whatever else he wanted to. You were his, uh, pretty much until the age of 20. Um, you lived with this from 12 to 20. So after every Spartan male, there were clubs. That's the best. There's probably a better name for them, but they were clubs of men, all Spartan fighting men, and that is where they spent most of their time training to fight, drinking, vinegar and pig's blood. Like these guys, the word Spartan for cheap or not a lot. That's where it comes from, is a Spartan society, because you know it's a great way to find out stuff about the Spartans is to read about what other Greeks said about them. Like the women were shocking. Like the Greeks, the Spartans, they walked around half naked, and a lot of that was to do with fat shaming. And the women would fat shame the men. They were perfectly allowed, and it was brutal, and it was a way to keep everybody in shape. These there was also an extreme uh, homosexual side. You know, And it's the greatest, you know, the greatest military soldiers ever in the ancient world, probably, were all very homosexual. Their whole system was built on that. When they were basically at, um, I believe, between 20 and 30, when they were given a wife, this is where they'd be given a wife, they'd be given a plot of land and some slaves. Remember, the state owns them, they're to use them, and they're to use the woman to make babies, and that's all they did. There are stories that to get a Spartan man to spend any time with his wife after they were married, they had to shave her head and wrap her in a white blanket and no lights in the room. And this could go on for a long time. Um, and I think, we can say, of course, how horrible the obvious things that happened to the young boys was, because we can use our imaginations, obviously, to know what these boys went to live with these men. But these were not just brothers in arms, these men were lovers. They loved each other. Okay. So you can imagine how tight that would make these men on the battlefield, as far as fighting together as a unit. There was no women and men were together to make more Spartans, which was the most important thing. But there was no husband-wife type relationship, the men spent all their time at these clubs. And once a boy, even after he survives the school, okay, he makes it out of school, he survives the training with the random Spartan he's sent to, then he has to be accepted into the club. And there's no guarantees for any of this, but he would generally go to the club, of course, his sponsor was a member of. And you become a member of this club, and they're just, you could almost think of them as different units in a military, right? They'd all have their own names, their own customs, things of this nature. But basically, they were there to hang out with their brothers in arms and train. And that's what a Spartan male citizen did. He did no farming, he did no accounting. The woman, that's why women had so much power in Sparta. They ran the household. They did all that. They made sure there was, groceries in the house and everyone was taken care of, and they did the land. The men were never there. All they did was fight. That's it. They wrestled, they fought, they trained, they threw javelins, they used their shield. That's all they did. You can imagine how formidable a 30-year-old man would be when he had been doing nothing but that from the age of 7. This is Sparta, right? This is what I really want to try to get through, is like the imagine that. Like we've talked about Japanese samurai. They did mostly just fighting, but they had other things to do. They had tax collections, they were police, right? They were actually family men, a lot of them. Same with the Normans. They still dealt with their families. They had to go around their estates. They had a lot of political things they had to do. They both samurais and Norman knights, and they spent tons of time training as fighting, the jousting and the tournaments. But that's all Spartans did. That's it, right? This was, and they were to protect the state. The state was everything was for the state. And these men did not fear death. In fact, the biggest fear to them would be to die in their sleep or to die in bed. That was the biggest fear. Well, there was a saying the women would say, I believe, is when the men went off to war, come back with your shield or on it, meaning, you know, win or die. And there was no, um, dying in battle is looked upon as heroic, right? And yeah, this was the Spartan fighting force. Now they didn't become full citizens till the age of 30, which is quite late, in that age. So you can imagine why they were so, make as many children as you can, right? Besides the ones they're tossing, right? Besides the many that die in the school, you know, it, they they could never make enough Spartans, obviously. And a lot of the reasons, these husband and wife relationships were not the same as, in most areas. The men were basically forced to go, literally forced. You'll see their wives. So Spartan, they had what are they famous for? They wore their hair was long, and they wore beards, but no mustache, just the beard, like I don't know, like an Abe Lincoln style type thing. That's how they, that's all the depictions you always see that. Um, they had that famous red cloak. I don't know what it was called. It's funny, they uh, they didn't have the Spartans never left like much for architecture and buildings like Athens did. That's just what building monuments and things that would last was not something that the Spartans were thought was very important. They do have some stuff, and it's really rare to find. Like they found that statue, that Spartan statue that they called Leonidas. Um, I don't know when they found that, 20 years ago. It's in a museum somewhere, but it's pretty cool. But they find figurines, um, they find jewelry, but as far as like buildings go, there's not much left. So as I said, um, there was no walls around Sparta, and then were the walls. And as I also said, the battles that happened, the Spartans could never ever field enough men. They just couldn't. Every time they left, there was a revolt. Right. So the Battle of Thermopylae. That's the name. Thermopylae. There's still a what do you call it? A plaque there, a monument there. I can't remember what it says, but it's really cool. So look up it, where the 300 Spartans died. As I said, there's also like 5 to 7,000 Athenians there that we don't really hear about. But so the Spartans helped defeat the Persians eventually, and then as happens, in city states and politics, they start, the Greeks start fighting each other, and Sparta and Athens had um, a very long war that went back and forth. I do believe eventually Greece forced a rout in that war. I don't know exactly the details. Um, Peloponnesian War. Man, I'm bad with these names. Peloponnesian War was the one Sparta versus Athens. Um, but yeah, so but if at their height, if they had 30,000 men, they could only send 15,000 off to fight. Very defensive force because there was every time there was a lot of slave uprisings, and then these slaves they outnumber them 7, 8 to 1. So you can imagine the carnage that would happen. And it just needed that force just to hold down their daily life. So there we talked about the Spartan and the word for it, right? Why it means Spartan, or it came from. They had anti-luxury laws. Like they're like they didn't really have currency. They used iron bars or like bartering system. Money was not a thing really. I don't know. Like acquiring wealth was looked down upon. That was looked as a very Athens thing to do, right? You want the state to be powerful. You don't want to be powerful. You don't own anything anyway, really. The state owns all of it. Now, what's interesting though is if a Spartan warrior died in battle, his wife could keep that property. She could. She ran it anyway. right? She's providing food. She probably has children to take care of, and she would probably be given another young man when he came out to be married. You know, if she was, so they were. It was shocking to the Greeks how much power the women had and how they could talk. Like there's quite a bit of we hear quite a bit of things from scholars and contemporaries in Athens and other areas of Greece who visited Sparta and just could not believe how much freedom. No, I'm not saying it was this is a great, you know, women's lib place. It's not. They were effectively treated as breeding machines. But as far as women were treated in Greece, it was just something else. Um, Now they did like music and poetry and dancing, and the women especially. There's a there's a set of figurines in one of the Greek museums that shows females a female Spartan dancing, and again, it looks very athletic. And I'm sure the women were involved in athletics, maybe not as much as the men, but quite a bit as much. Because as I said, this is a society of fat shaming. This is a society of your body is your temple that runs the state, that helps protect the state. The women need to be healthy for children. The men need to be healthy to defend the state, right? So they're the dance. They did a lot of dancing. I'm not sure some music and poetry. I'm not sure about drama or anything like that. But they had, of course, your gymno, gymnopadia, gymnasium, which was a festival of basically naked dancing, athletics, and boys competitions. They had uh, others festivals. Some of these festivals, like towards their Greek gods, you know, it's prevented wars at sometimes that they couldn't even march to war because of some of these festivals and these oracles really having almost more power than the king, right? Or at least a lot of sway. So there's a story of there's this cave where the Spartans would go and see these oracles. And I can't remember what it was, but they thought maybe that because of natural geology, there was some sort of gas seeping in these caves that would actually cause hallucinations and maybe contributed to a lot of the power that the Spartans thought these oracles had. Because at one time, they don't seem as superstitious as a lot of the Greeks, but then they really are with certain things, major decisions couldn't be made without, a saying from basically priests or priestesses. I believe they were women. And they couldn't march to war on certain days and certain festivals, even if the people were on their doorstep, they just, you know, they couldn't do it. So, long story, very short, very short in form. We have the most militaristic society and one of the most controlled societies ever, way back, in 600 BC. you know, Things we wouldn't really hear of, like communist type things, you know, till much, much later in history. And I'm sure there was other societies that did, kind of the same thing, but never to the extent that that had happened with the Spartans. They really went to their whole everything was just dedicated to. There was no individuals, you know. There was no their lives were there. There was no accumulation of wealth. It was the state that needed the wealth. You cowardice. You know, there were, not everybody can live up to the amazing standard of being a Spartan warrior, obviously. And there were, guys that fled battles, and I heard even the guy who Leonidas forced to go back, like forced him to go back and spread the word of what had happened at that battle. Even he was pretty much ostracized when he came back, forced to leave battle. And I think he eventually threw himself. I don't remember what battle it was, but he eventually threw himself into battle so he could and killed himself basically, using death by war, suicide by war to get his beautiful death, as they called it. Yeah, you'd basically have to leave Sparta at that point if you were ever such a deserter, anything like that. Um, I don't know a whole lot about the specifics of their constitution, and even like how their daily politics were with the two kings and how that worked. There are probably some good references out there on maybe some better. The problem with Sparta and probably a lot of parts of ancient Greece is there's just Athens. You got monuments, you got buildings, you got a lot of writing. We don't have a lot of that with Sparta, and a lot of the things we hear about Sparta are from other Greek city-states. They didn't have great historians, and that just that wasn't something they did. But it's interesting to me, the greatest, the fall of Sparta, what happened, like the decline, basically. After the battle of, I think it was with Athens, they never really recovered their old strength. There was more slave uprisings. um, there were reform attempts by a couple kings to try to restore, the land and redistribute the slaves and try to just, you know, restore Sparta to its former glory. It never really did, and eventually it became part of Rome. And a funny thing is it became part of Rome. I don't know, 150 BC, 100 BC, somewhere around there, after the Achaean War. And even in Roman times, it was like a tourist attraction, right? They maintained some of their traditional rituals and training and tourism for like prestige, but for tourism, right? Even the Romans were like, hey, because think about it. If, you know, it's like the Romans looking at the Spartans is like us looking at, you know, 13th, 14th century medieval England or feudal Japan or, ancient China. So we're well, a lot of us are really fascinated with that part of history. So in the Romans, the same. So you'd have actual Spartans, basically probably LARPing. I don't know, but it's pretty interesting. So yeah, that's a really brief, just going over half an hour here, but I wanted to just talk about something a little bit different than what my other podcasts have been, and ancient Sparta's, pretty interesting. Um, a whole, what is it? Helen, the whole start of the Trojan War. Helen was a Spartan, wasn't she? Which is wild to me because Spartan women were considered very, very, very different from all the other Greek women as far as attitudes and rights and things like that went. So that was always very interesting to me. The Trojan War would be another really cool thing to get into. The problem with that is I have sometimes a hard time separating what's myth and what they actually have found on record. It's very convoluted even when you read on things like that. And maybe it's just something like that's better just to be left to kind of like what is it a myth? Is it true? Like we know King Arthur, for instance, right, is a stolen Welsh myth. But anyway, Trojan War. Anyway, I go off topic. So yeah, hope you guys like that. I'm gonna do my season one's gonna continue just to be Plantagenet. kings, going through that. And then this season two, I'll do the Spartans. I might do something with Rome. Rome will have to break into, and then also I do know quite a bit about, and I'm very interested in the Second World War. So that's something else I could get into if people are interested in that. Unfortunately, I know very little about the First World War. I'm confused how that war even started. But anyway, again, so I hope you enjoyed this. A little bit different than what I usually do. And wherever you are, I hope you have a great day, great evening, great morning. Thanks for listening. Leave a comment if you want, a request, things like that. Um, yeah, and again, thanks for listening and have a great day.